You know, nothing tests a leader like a crisis. Seriously, when the stakes are sky high, time is running out, and just pure uncertainty is everywhere, that's when we see what leadership is really made of. It's the ultimate trial by fire, right? It shows you who can navigate the storm and who just gets swept away. But what is it? What's the secret sauce that separates success from failure? Well, that's what we're going to dig into.
Just think about President George W. Bush for a second. After the 9/11 attacks, he was widely seen as this decisive, effective leader. He really shaped the public story with a ton of clarity and resolve. But then, just 4 years later, Hurricane Katrina hits. And that very same leader, he seemed completely ineffective, unable to frame the response or really inspire any confidence. So, same person, totally different crises, and wildly different outcomes. What gives? What's the variable that makes a leader crush it in one crisis and totally fumble in another? That is the question at the heart of this explainer.
And this quote from Rahm Emanuel, it just perfectly captures this really crucial, kind of counterintuitive idea. For a smart leader, a crisis isn't just some threat you have to manage. It's a window of opportunity. It's this moment where the normal rules just get thrown out, and all of a sudden radical change becomes possible. It lets leaders push through reforms that would have been absolutely unthinkable just a few days earlier.
So to really get how leaders find their way through these moments, here's our roadmap. We're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll define what a crisis actually is. Then we'll get into the 3 core leadership jobs: making sense, making decisions, and making meaning. And finally, we'll look at what happens after the smoke clears, in that super important phase of accountability and learning.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The word crisis gets tossed around all the time, right? But if we're going to analyze leadership, we need to be a little more precise. What really turns a regular old problem into a full-blown crisis?
So here's the official take. A crisis is when the very core values of a system, we're talking our safety, our security, the rule of law, are under threat. This isn't just a bad day at the office. This is a moment that demands immediate action, usually when we have no idea what's going on.
We can pretty much boil that down to 3 essential ingredients. First, you've got a massive threat to our basic way of life. Second, there's this intense urgency, this feeling that the clock is ticking and you have to make a decision right now. And third, there's just profound uncertainty. It's that fog of war, you know? You're dealing with known unknowns and even scarier, unknown unknowns. So, threat, urgency, and uncertainty. That's the trifecta. That's a crisis. So you find yourself in the middle of a crisis. What is the absolute first job of a leader? Well, that's task 1, making sense. And it's all about one thing, figuring out what on earth is actually happening.
Now here's the thing that's so tough about this. When you look back, the warning signs of a crisis almost always seem obvious. But at the time, those clues are like scattered puzzle pieces. They're held by different people in different departments who aren't talking to each other. So the failure usually isn't a lack of information, it's a failure to connect the dots and see the whole picture.
The Challenger disaster is just a tragic, perfect example of this. You had engineers warning that the cold weather on launch day could cause these critical O-rings to fail. But NASA's culture? It was all about hard, quantifiable data. The engineers' fears were dismissed as just a gut feeling because they didn't have 100% definitive proof. Their warnings were shot down, and NASA pushed ahead. The result was an absolute catastrophe. All the puzzle pieces were on the table, but the culture of the organization made it impossible to put them together.
Okay, so once a leader has some kind of grip on the situation, even if it's a shaky one, they have to do something. And that brings us to task 2, making decisions. This is that moment where a leader has to make the call, often with incomplete information and under just incredible pressure. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the ultimate example. President Kennedy and his team are looking at these photos of Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Their options: an airstrike, a full-on invasion, or a naval blockade. And every single one of those paths carried an unimaginable risk, the very real chance of starting a nuclear war. Making a decision in that room, that might be the heaviest burden any leader has ever had to carry. But even in a room full of brilliant people like Kennedy's, there's this hidden trap, and it's called groupthink. This is what happens when the pressure to just agree with everyone else becomes so strong that it completely silences any disagreement. It just overrides a realistic look at the options and leads to these really dysfunctional, sometimes disastrous decisions.
So for any leader, the most important question to ask is this one right here. Just look around the table. Is everyone just nodding along? Is this consensus forming way too easily, way too fast? Because if it is, that is a huge red flag.
A good leader has to actively encourage debate and disagreement, especially when the pressure is on. And then, when it comes to actually carrying out those decisions, leaders face this big choice. Do you centralize everything, with every single order coming from the top? That gives you a unified plan for sure, but it can also create bottlenecks and ignore the experts on the ground. Or do you decentralize? You empower the people on the front lines to improvise. That's way faster and more flexible, but it absolutely requires a deep foundation of shared values and trust, so everyone's pulling in the same direction. There's no one right answer here. It's a strategic call every leader has to make.
Which brings us to our third task. And believe me, this one is just as critical as the first two. It's not enough to manage the crisis operationally. A leader also has to manage the story. This is task 3, making meaning.
You see, in any crisis, there is a battle for the narrative. A leader has to step up and frame what's happening. They need to tell a compelling story that answers 3 simple questions for the public. What's going on? What does this mean for us? And what are we doing about it? And that story, it has to be factual, it has to give people something they can do, and most of all, it has to inspire confidence. And when a leader gets this wrong, man, the consequences can be just devastating. Take the 2004 Madrid train bombings. Prime Minister Aznar immediately and very publicly blamed the Basque separatist group ETA. But pretty quickly, evidence started pointing to Al-Qaeda. His whole narrative just crumbled. And the public didn't see it as an honest mistake. They saw it as a deliberate, politically motivated lie to distract from the unpopular Iraq War. Just days later, his party was voted out of office. He lost the battle for the story, and it cost him literally everything.
And that leads us to the aftermath. Okay, so the immediate danger is gone. The leader's job is done, right? Not even close. In fact, a whole new, much more political crisis is often just getting started. This is the phase of accountability and, hopefully, learning.
The source material calls this the crisis after the crisis, and that's exactly what it is. This is when the political gloves come off. Investigations get launched, hearings are held, the media goes into a frenzy. This is the accountability phase, and for leaders, it's this high-stakes blame game where careers and legacies are made or broken.
And during this phase, you'll see leaders pull from a pretty standard playbook of tactics. They might try denial, saying it wasn't that bad. A super common one is scapegoating, finding someone else to blame and then proudly announcing you've punished them. Or they might go for justification, arguing, hey, I had to choose the lesser of 2 evils. And finally, you have symbolic reform, where they announce some new policies to look like they're learning without actually fixing the deep-down problem. Keep an eye out for these. You will see them everywhere.
But beyond all the finger-pointing, there is one final and, you could argue, most important leadership task: to actually learn. A crisis is like this incredibly harsh spotlight. It reveals all the hidden cracks and deep flaws in our organizations and systems. And the ultimate test of leadership is whether they can take that moment of exposure and turn it into real, meaningful, lasting change.
But here's the catch. Not all learning is the same. There's this huge difference between single-loop and double-loop learning. Single-loop learning just asks, did we fix the immediate problem? It's like clearing a car off the road. Yeah, it's necessary, but it doesn't stop the next crash. Double-loop learning goes way deeper. It asks, did we fix the system that caused the problem? So you're not just clearing the car, you're redesigning the dangerous intersection that caused the crash. It's much harder, it's much rarer, but is the only way to truly prevent the next crisis.
So, there you have it. That's our 5-part toolkit for really looking at leadership when things go wrong. First, making sense to see the full picture. Then, making decisions, acting decisively while avoiding groupthink. Then, making meaning to frame the narrative. Next, accounting to manage the blame game with integrity. And finally, learning to drive real systemic change.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty big question for our time. We live in this age of what experts call transboundary crises, things like pandemics, financial meltdowns, climate events, that just don't care about borders or industries. So in this incredibly complex, interconnected world we've built, are these 5 fundamental tasks of leadership becoming more difficult, more demanding, and more essential than they have ever been before?